This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. Over the last 5 years, we've brought you well over 100 stories on every imaginable aspect of human flourishing. But today's focus is on one of the simplest and most tender aspects of what it takes to sustain life. It's a conversation about the needs of every society and every soul on the planet, past, present, and future. It's a conversation about care.
If you ask most people, what's the most morally profound, significant, meaningful thing in your life, they'll say something about the way that they have been taking care of children or parents or friends or people who are ill or spouses. There's something very distinctive about it. It's just intrinsic to the human condition is that we're going to be babies, we're going to be ill, we're going to be old. That just comes with the territory of being human. And care seems to be a way of allowing us as a community, as a species, to negotiate these kinds of transitions, to make the transitions work.
Dr. Alison Gopnik is a professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and a leading researcher on caregiving. Though care is needed at every stage of life in every nation and neighborhood, Dr. Gopnik doesn't actually have much company in her field of expertise.
Caregiving is a really fundamental, deep part of human nature, and yet it's been largely invisible in the academic world. So if you look at moral philosophy or moral psychology or politics or economics, you don't see very much discussion of caregiving. And I think that's partly because caregiving is really different from our other kinds of social relationships. The kind of classic description of human relations in the academy is some version of the social contract theory. So the basic idea is, why do human beings cooperate? Why am I going to be altruistic towards you? Well, there's some kind of reciprocity. I do something for you, you do something for me. But caregiving isn't like that. The very nature of caregiving is that we care for people like infants or elders who are not going to be able to reciprocate. And that means that the whole structure of caregiving doesn't fit very well into the usual philosophical and political frameworks.
What's the equation of caregiving?
What happens is you have two people, they have different resources, they have different goals. But the very fact that one of them has more resources than the other makes the person who has more try to help the person who has less to accomplish their goals, not the goals of the person who has more. That makes it a very profound relation, but one that's very different from other relations.
The need for care is most obvious with newborn babies, but the human family, whether we're technically family or not, gives and receives care throughout every chapter of life.
An infant doesn't have capacities and resources. That's exactly the reason why we take care of them. And some of this seems to be rooted biologically in kinship, so it's our baby. But for humans, it becomes much more general. So for humans, we'll take care of someone who needs care sort of independently of whether they're kin or not. We know that it's biologically extremely important and very characteristic of human beings that we have a much wider range of people that we care for, and that care is a really essential part of our evolutionary framework, what makes us human. So it's been this kind of mismatch between the biological importance of this, our everyday experience of how important it is, and the fact that it doesn't fit with the usual ways of thinking about, say, politics or social relationships or moral capacities.
Dr. Gopnik's research underscores that
an important piece of care is that it's often very local. We care for the people who we know, who we see, even if they're not our biological kin.
Proximity is a key and complicating factor, perhaps especially in America.
The fact that we're close to them, that we're interacting with them, seems to play a really important part in care. And yet, we separate people out in our culture. The moms and dads are at work, the kids are at school, the grandparents are in Florida. That's kind of our structure. And maybe if we had the grandparents and the elders and the kids and the adults physically closer together, that would provide a structure in which we could have more care.
She wants to understand more about the generational aspects of care.
One of the things that I've been especially interested in is the role of elders, of grandparents. We take care of our children, we take care of our grandchildren, and that care from elders for children, I think, is really a central part of human success and human progress. We have this very long postmenopausal grandmotherhood, unlike any of our closest primate relatives. It's really dramatic for grandmothers because they go through menopause, but it's also true for grandfathers that we live for an extra 20 years and always have, even did in forager cultures, compared to our closest primate relatives, even though we're not really reproducing in that 20 years. And a prevalent account is that 20 years is the 20 years when we can take care of other people. And then, of course, it becomes a very deep part of our moral and philosophical and even our religious identity that we're capable of having that kind of care.
It starts out being rooted in biology, but becomes something that really underpins a lot of the most valuable aspects of human life.
In fact, humans are so uniquely wired for care that we offer care in ways that some would argue aren't even logical.
We care for the dead. So even though the dead, by definition, don't have resources and can't help us or reciprocate, we think it's important to worry about what the people in the past wanted. We think it's important to respect the wishes of the dead. We think it's important to remember them. And that's a really vivid example of the way that we care about people who can't care for themselves, even if they're not in any position to reciprocate.
Care is needed whenever humans are at a point of transformation.
If you think about a whole life, right, what's always happening across our lives, and I actually think this is a really important part of human success, is that we move from one kind of intelligence or one kind of project to another. And that means we move from dependence to independence and back again throughout our whole lives.
There's something about that care, something about trying to make those transitions from one stage of life to another work that I think is a very deep value for human beings. How do we make a transition from a 3-month-old who literally has to be held and fed and have their diapers changed all the time to just 20 years later, a grown-up adult who's going to be off on their own and may even be taking care of their own mother? How do we deal with the transition at the end of our lives from being in charge, getting resources, to maybe passing on wisdom or having a different kind of relationship to other people? And how do we manage that transition from being independent to being dependent to dying in a way that's satisfying and graceful and dignified? That, I think, is a really deep question.
To answer those questions, Dr. Gopnik is leading a research project with an international team of experts, including leaders in elder care and child care, religious scholars, philosophers, sociologists, educators, political scientists.
The mission is to think about the way that we care for other people. What we're trying to do with this project is get care away from, here's the practicalities of childcare, here's the crisis in elder care, to think about it in a more general philosophical way, try and think about what it is that care means. And if you start doing that, then something like care for the planet becomes very vivid. What does it mean? Does it mean care for the planet so that we can accomplish our own ends, that we don't die of heat and carbon? Does it mean some sense that the natural world has its own aims? There's something that it means for, say, an ecological community to thrive, and we need to provide the circumstances for that community to thrive? How do we figure out what it means to help support nature, for instance? I think those are all really interesting questions.
Big strength of this project is going beyond just thinking about one group that we care for and trying to think about how care works in general.
Dr. Gopnik says that care has its own kind of intelligence.
We're really interested in the intelligence of care. People sometimes react like care and intelligence, that's an oxymoron, those are different. But if you actually think about what you have to do to care for someone, especially think about what you have to do to care for your elderly parents, that requires a tremendous amount of intelligence and calculation and thought. What would be best for them? What do they want? How do I decide what would allow them to develop goals for themselves?
Dr. Gopnik is trying to fill in the gaps of academic research.
What are our intuitive ideas about care? We know there's a literature about the negative effects of not having care, especially for children. And one of the really striking things that's happened in the last 30 years is that these differences in what's sometimes called adverse experiences, early experiences without care, those can affect the way people function when they're 50s. It can affect things like how likely are you to get a heart attack when you're 50? And how that works, why those relations seem to be so important is a big question. What do people themselves think when they think about care? And especially, what do children think about care? If you think about it, care is the most important thing in children's lives. It's what keeps them alive. It's the thing that they experience the most of. And yet, although we know a lot about children's everyday theories about how the social world works, we know nothing about what children think about care. What do children think is going to happen when one person is caring for another? What do they think about the difference between what a child will do when mom is present or when dad is present or when there's no one else around at all? Do they think that this kind of asymmetry is intrinsic to care? We have just a few studies that we've just started that suggest that even young kids, 4 and 5-year-olds, think that if you don't actually have tit-for-tat reciprocation, that's a signal that someone's caring for you. So the fact that mom will put a blanket on you, even if you don't put a blanket on mom, is something that even little kids seem to understand and think about. So there's enormous scope for thinking about how do kids learn about care? How do they become caregivers themselves? How do they learn how to become caregivers as adults? What do infants think about care? What do they know? What can they predict about who will care for someone else? And how does it change as we're embedded in a particular culture? We have experiences of care. We learn about care and caregiving. That's a really central question.
Caregiving challenges how we might typically organize relationships and social structures.
How do we discriminate care from power? Usually, if you think about it, that first person is going to be the ruler and the second person is going to be the subject. And yet, in cases of care, this gets reversed. It's a real question about how do you keep caring from flipping over into a power relation? And vice versa, because care is really important for people. You could imagine that someone might manipulate that, present themselves as being needy, in need of care, as a kind of form of power themselves. So I think what the relationships are between power and care is something that's really important.
Dr. Gopnik asserts that care is, at its core, political.
We have a sort of picture of how care works in what's sometimes called weird, Western, educated, industrial, rich democracy context.
But care is really different across many different cultures, and yet it also seems to be a human universal. Babies literally couldn't survive unless someone cared for them. How much can we scale up care from the relationships that you have to your mother or to your child to a whole community or even a whole planet? The Confucian philosopher Mengzi made an argument that the basis of politics should be rooted in these relationships that we have to our brothers or our sisters or our parents, that what you need to do is scale that up. That's the basis of politics. But how do you scale that up? How do you go from just here's how I feel about this one particular person to here's how I feel about the planet? And is there a way of doing that that captures the distinctive character of care? How we implement care in liberal democracy, how that works, I think, is a really interesting challenge. Again, because care is so often about a local community, a small group of people. How can you make that happen in a big, industrial, mobile, alienated modern society?
Dr. Gopnik's international study illuminates the differences in care across diverse cultures, but her personal perspective is American.
We don't even have a good word for the people who are cared for, even though all of us are going to have to be cared for at some point in our lives. In our culture, especially our kind of individualist culture, there's often a sense that there's something wrong with being cared for, that we shouldn't be in the category of someone who has to be taken care of. And that's a big question, both in, say, thinking about adolescence and thinking about elders or thinking about the ill. There's a sort of feeling of, no, I shouldn't have to have someone take care of me. I should be able to just do this on my own. And I think if people could think, no, actually being cared for is part of being human as much as caring for others is part of being human. Trying to think about how you could be cared for in a way that isn't exploitative, that isn't a sign of weakness. That's a big, important question to answer.
Her research reveals that the United States is an outlier in how it supports care, or rather, how it doesn't.
Just about every civilized Western country devotes more resources to care from the state than the United States does. The United States is really a terrible outlier in terms of how much we provide support. In the United States in particular, we have this terrible care crisis, both caring for children and in some ways even more caring for elders. Parents find themselves spending more and more money to be able to get reasonable childcare. And we have a similar kind of issue now with elder care. I think it's a pretty fair generalization to say that in most cultures, there's more different people who are caring for people who need care than in ours, where it tends to be very relatively narrow. So we have this crisis at both ends. Something that's as important, as central to us, is taking care of our children and taking care of our elders. We're terribly in need of resources, and we don't have natural ways of getting those resources. So we're thinking about things like, could you have an elder care allowance that was like a family allowance, where, say, the daughter or the son in the family could get an allowance to take care of an elderly parent, give them some of the resources to do that. At the moment, if you're trying to take care of an elderly parent, for instance, you're completely on your own. You don't have any support. And it's incredibly intensive kind of burden for people at the same time that it's something that's incredibly important for people. We know that more and more people are living into their 90s. More and more people are going to be in need of care. And yet, again, it's the children who have to figure out, how do I pay for the assisted living center for my father, or how do I figure out how to take care of them myself? It's an irony that in the United States, the richest community in the history of mankind, we're specifically having problems finding resources to do these really basic and important human projects of care.
It's not just caregiving in the United States that doesn't have enough funding support. It's the caregivers themselves.
The people who are doing that work tend to be underpaid and don't have very much support. If you look at people who are childcare workers or people who are elder care workers, they're overwhelmingly women, and often in the United States, immigrant women of color. But in general, women have done a great deal of this work. And there's a real double-edged sword about this, because as with other kinds of women's work, that has led the work to be devalued and not taken seriously like other kinds of work. But it's also been kind of problematic for things like feminism, because you don't want women just to be stereotyped as the caregivers. And we really have kind of reverse stereotypes where we don't let men be involved in caregiving. So even though in other cultures, men are much more involved in caregiving, in our culture, we exclude men from a lot of these caregiving roles and caregiving professions, even though we have every evidence that men are just as good and as involved in caregiving as women are. So how do we deal with this kind of gendered tradition and history of care in the way that we would want to do in a society where we think that women should be doing more than just being caregivers?
Dr. Gopnik, who is part of the Berkeley AI Research Lab, believes it's possible that the expansion of AI may actually help expand resources for caring in America.
Even if AI takes over a lot of the high-prestige white-collar jobs, like doing clerical work or middle management, I think care is going to be, that will make us appreciate even more the things that really seem to be uniquely human. And maybe the consequence of that will be that things like care will take on a new kind of status and a new kind of prestige and be paid better, because they're so rooted in genuinely human interactions.
Her research study has highlighted the need for legislation to address the American caregiving crisis, which touches everyone's lives, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum.
One of the things that makes care interesting is that it crosses a lot of what you might think of as the usual sort of partisan divides, right?
A lot of the mechanisms we usually use, like markets or states, don't seem to work terribly well in the case of care.
Places like Georgia or Oklahoma have been places where universal childcare was implemented. So everybody cares about families. Everybody cares about the way that we take care of children and the way that we take care of elders. And the very fact that it isn't completely obvious about how do you do this, I think means that there's a great opportunity for policies that kind of cross some of our traditional divides.
What policies does Dr. Gopnik think are needed?
There are some really obvious low-hanging fruit policies that do exist in most other civilized countries. But there are other policies like having more intergenerational housing. And those don't quite fit the usual picture we have of policy, but those policies might make a really big difference in people's lives. Another example is the idea that you could have an elder care commitment. Marriage is one of the very few examples we have of a legal commitment that is involved in care. Suppose we had sort of the equivalent of marriage for being committed to a child, independently of what else happened in a marriage, or things like godparents were a wonderful religious institution, a way of having people committed to taking care of a child who weren't necessarily the biological parents of the child. So you could imagine having formal godparent relationships, or for the many, many people who don't have children themselves or don't have extended family, being able to have just a friend who comes in and says, I'm committed to taking care of this person, or a group of friends who say, I'm committed to taking care of this person.
Whatever policies or practices are part of how we care for each other, humans require care, both giving and receiving it, in order to flourish.
Having close relationships, caring for other people, is one of the central engines of human happiness and thriving. The thing that really seems to make people happy often is caring for other people.
The satisfactions of care seem to be so deep. They seem to be so much what makes you thrive and flourish.
When you ask people later on, what's the thing in your life that was most important to you, that made you happy, that gave you the most meaning, people will often talk about the close relationships that they have. And we know, for example, that having close relationships is one of the things that makes us healthy, that makes us happy, that makes us thrive in later life. I'm definitely in favor of people having nice houses and nice furniture and living well, living long, and having material comforts. And we have pretty good mechanisms for making that happen. But I think what it really means to have a flourishing, thriving life is to be in these relationships of care with other people.
Before we close today, I just want to tell you that the Stories of Impact team really cares about you. We check our stats each week, so we know that there are thousands of you across the world listening. We may not have an opportunity to know you personally, but each story we offer is designed to give you personally something beautiful, comforting, hopeful, interesting, good. We hope you feel our care, wherever you are, in every episode. Thank you for caring for us, by supporting and sharing our work. We're really grateful for you. We hope you'll come back in 2 weeks for another new episode. In the meantime, please share the Stories of Impact podcast with someone you think would love it. And we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch at storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with an interview by Richard Sergey. Written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Executive producer, Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.